Hello, my name is Fran Robertson. I am the Clinical Director with the Center for Children and Families in Norman, Oklahoma. I'm glad to be with you today. We are looking at our fourth segment of child abuse and neglect, and we'll focus on frequently asked questions. First, we ask, who is a mandated reporter? Well, everyone is. All medical people, all educators, all neighbors, all social workers, all daycare providers, everyone. Legislators, law enforcement folks, we're all required to report suspicion of child abuse and neglect. As a mandated reporter, who do I call? Second question. You will call the Department of Human Services. The DHS Child Abuse Hotline number is listed here, 1-800-522-3511. Or, if it is during the daytime hours, office hours, you may call your local county Department of Human Services office. Do I have to know there is abuse or neglect before I call the Department of Human Services? No, you don't have to know it. You don't have to prove it. All of us, as mandated reporters, are required to report any suspicion of abuse or neglect. And good faith reporters who attempt to find out more before reporting can risk the clarity and accurateness of the formal investigation. You can compromise that investigation by trying to find out too much. Interviews of all children must be left to the trained DHS investigators. This is a question for you, especially in the schools. What if my boss, principal, counselor, lead teacher, tells me not to report a suspicion of child abuse or neglect to the Department of Human Services? Well, this is the answer. No employer may tell employees not to report a suspicion of child abuse or neglect. Failure to report this is actually a crime, and no person, regardless of their relationship to the child or the family, is exempt from reporting suspected abuse. It is an individual responsibility. Well, can I just tell my principal or school counselor and let them make the report to the Department of Human Services? Actually, no. You have to make the call. DHS professionals really need to talk to the person who suspects the abuse or neglect and who witnessed or was told about the abuse or neglect by a child. That first-hand report is very important. Will my report to the Department of Human Services regarding the suspicion of child abuse or neglect be confidential? Yes. It is the Department of Human Services policy and state law, both, require strict maintenance of the confidentiality of reporters of child abuse. If the incident does become court-involved, information on the reporter could be requested by the court. However, that's fairly rare. It doesn't happen very often. The department will also accept anonymous reports if you have a great concern about that. Well, what is my responsibility regarding confidentiality of the report made on one of my students? It's a very good question. As professionals, we care about children. We want them to be safe. We get very concerned when they're not. We have to honor the confidentiality of that child and family by really talking only to our supervisor and by making a report. That is mandated, of course. When that information leaks out to another colleague or is told in a more public arena like the teacher's lounge or other places, you have risked the confidentiality for that student and have become in some ways a less trustworthy person for that child. What if I make a report and I'm wrong? Can I be sued? You can't. A person reporting in good faith is immune from both civil and criminal liability. So the bottom line is, it's a crime not to report, and you are immune if you make a report in good faith from criminal liability, civil and criminal liability. What if I'm worried something worse is going to happen to the child if a report is made? And this is a concern many of us have when we make a report. Well, I think the best recommendation on this is that if you have a concern that this child is going to be in greater danger, then when you're making the report, that needs to be kind of underlined and bolded with the person that's receiving the report to make sure they know that once this is begun to be, once a worker comes to this person's home or once someone knows that this has happened, there will be a greater risk to the child. You must tell the workers that so they can plan for that and know that's a safety issue. What if the Department of Human Services doesn't identify abuse or neglect and I'm still concerned about the child's safety? And we know this happens. That can happen because the report did not meet a particular criteria to be assessed or to be investigated, and or something may have happened, but we may not, as educators or as persons knowing the child out in the community, be able to tell what happened. So we may still be concerned. So what can you do? Well, if you have ongoing concerns, I would recommend documenting that report and what you and know what you as the reporter have a right to know. And that was covered, I believe, in the third segment of this series. The information about what you can rightly expect to know, so you can call back and ask. You also need to continue to observe the situation and note any further suspicions that you have. Make another report with additional information. Sometimes in some situations it may take multiple reports for the state to have enough criteria to actually act on it. And I know that that's a difficult thing to understand, but the department is also working under certain guidelines and criteria. If you continue to be dissatisfied with the responses from child welfare, I think you should have every right and responsibility to provide feedback to within the hierarchy of the Department of Human Services in your county, and if need be, you can go beyond your county. But a concern should not go unstated. You should go ahead and make that concern so that if there are problems with a particular worker, if there are problems with a particular assessment, if there are other situations, they can be addressed and corrected. Next question is, a report of suspected child abuse and neglect is made from our school. Is the school responsible for notifying the parents of the child? No, you're not. You're not required. State law specifies that schools are not responsible for notifying parents that a child is interviewed. That's really the task of the Department of Human Services. So if they come to your school and ask to interview a child, you do not have to tell the parents. So another question that especially pertains to the schools. What are the special reporting issues for the schools? School personnel, and really this includes other folks too, like medical people, public health, mental health folks, and they're interacting with a child who shared something of concern, or you observe something of concern. It's important not to delve into that child's situation beyond determining whether there's a reason to believe that the child is being abused or neglected or is in danger. Remember, our only responsibility is to report suspicion, and we can affect the outcome of a trained investigator's interview if we do our own investigation. So we have to leave that to those professionals. I want to make a special note to you about the grown-ups. There may be parents, they may be guardians or grandparents who may be the perpetrators of child abuse and neglect. So often we spend a lot of time being very angry with these folks, and we need to hold these folks responsible for their behaviors. There is no question. But I think that one of the things that we need to know, and I know this from my many years of work with these families, these grown-ups may have abused or hurt children, but they more often than not, they love their children very much. They may not know the damage they're doing. They may have lived in a similar situation and actually be doing better than was done to them. It's hard to know. So it's easy for us to judge them and to blame them, but I think that if we work in a little bit different way, we'll get a better result in the long run for the child and their family. These grown-ups respond better to support than they do to hostile criticism, like we all do. Letting a parent know that things are bad and rough and what is it that they need for help or what would be useful to them is a much better response than criticizing them. These families are often very challenged. They're challenged by isolation. Sometimes they self-isolate. Sometimes they're isolated because of other circumstances. They're often challenged by finances and just general stability in their lives. They sometimes have many stressors. And as indicated earlier, many have a history of being abused or neglected themselves. The thing that sometimes we forget when we're in a professional role, especially as an educator, is that even though you have no intention of being intimidated, folks who live in isolation, have multiple stressors, and have histories of their own failures in school are often very intimidated by teachers and schools. It's hard for them sometimes just to come into the school building. To come to a school conference is a scary thing for them. They may not look scared, but we all know that underneath blustery, aggressive behavior often is fear. So I encourage you to keep that in mind as you deal with these families. Know that they do love their children and that the children do love them. And the situation inside the family is a very complicated one. So we don't need to add to that by being an outside criticizer of that family if we can help it. So our challenge, your challenge as a professional educator, is to continue. You're already doing this, but to continue to be a part of the community raising and teaching children. They're all of our children. To be very clear about reporting suspicion of child abuse and neglect, how to handle that in terms of listening to the child that we talked about in Part 3, and how to make that report and what to expect out of that report. And then lastly, to apply more compassion than criticism toward the complex issues for those families where child abuse and neglect occur. I'll be pleased for you to contact me if you need to do so at this number or this email address. Thank you very much.